Hi, I'm Mitch Gallagher. Welcome to Sweetwater Soundcheck. This time out, a new analog mix bus processor from SSL. Let's get started. Today we're checking out Fusion, a stereo analog color processor from Solid State Logic. Now this is a mix bus processor that's specifically designed for hybrid recording studios where you're working in the digital domain, but you want to add analog characteristics to your final mix. So this allows you to emulate the characteristics that are added to a signal by a mix console and by analog tape. Let's take a tour of what this box does. Fusion is separated into multiple modules, and you can access those independently, or you can use them all together to get a composite processing that's applied to your stereo mix. We have an input trim control on the front panel, which allows you to set the level that's feeding into the box. And this is important when you're working with the drive characteristics, as well as with the high-frequency compressor, as we'll see a little bit later. Next up, we have a high-pass filter processor. And this is right after the input trim, and it allows you to control boominess or excess rumble that might be in the bottom of your mix. We've got 3 frequencies, 30 Hz, 40 Hz, and 50 Hz, or you can bypass that filter. To my ears, it's actually a fairly gentle filter. It allows you to just kind of slope off that bottom end and tighten things up. I really like the way this high-pass filter works. Next up, we have a vintage drive processor. Now this is designed to add harmonic content to your signal in a similar fashion to an analog console's mix bus. We have a drive control and density control, and the two of those work together to basically set up the harmonics that you're adding into your signal, as well as the amount of harmonics that you're adding. Now this works with the input trim control, the amount of signal that's coming in, and then the drive to generate those harmonics. And we can bypass that independently from the other processors inside Fusion. We have a tricolor LED up here that shows a signal present, overload, as well as when the processor is active. What I have for you today is a song called Foundation, and this is the unmastered mix from my EP. You can hear that with a vintage drive inserted into the signal path, we get a bigger sound. It opens up the top end and adds some harmonic content there as well, a nice sheen across the top as we drive that harder. And you saw how the two different controls are interactive. We turn the drive up to get the amount, then the density tunes the harmonics. Next up, we have what SSL calls the Violet EQ. Now this is the first new EQ circuit from SSL in more than 25 years, and it's designed as a low-frequency EQ and a high-frequency EQ, basically shelving EQs. The low end has 4 frequencies, 30 Hz, 50 Hz, 70 Hz, and 80 Hz. And on the high end, we have 8 kHz, 12 kHz, 16 kHz, and 20 kHz. So you can really dial in the thump on the bottom of your mix, really round out that bottom end, and at the same time, add nice sheen on top and open up the air in your mix. On this mix, I like the low EQ set at the 70 Hz position. It really seems to bring out the thump on the kick drum. Now we can also dial in a nice top end sheen using the high frequency section. To my ears, the 12 kHz setting here brings out the top end on the cymbals, really gives us a nice airiness to those cymbals as they're ringing. As we increase the frequency, it does more on the air on the top end, and we have less direct effect on the cymbals and the lower frequency elements. Down here at 8 kHz, it's picking up the top end of several of the instruments and increasing the harshness a little bit, so I probably wouldn't use that on this mix. Again, I'd be more in the 12 kHz position. Next up, we have the high-frequency compressor, which is actually designed to emulate the characteristics of hitting an analog tape recorder. So what it does is smooth out the top end on your signal as you drive it harder. You can set the crossover frequency as well as the threshold of when that starts to operate. I've got that set to be a little more heavy-handed than I would normally use it, just so you can hear the effect. It's not a dramatic effect, but what it does is really round out that top end, and again, it kind of brings everything together, provides that analog tape-style glue. Moving to the right, we have stereo imaging. Now this has two controls, both space and width, and what this is a mid-side processor, so we can turn up the sides or the outside of the mix, making it seem wider, or we can turn up the center, which brings the focus more into the middle of the mix. Space opens up the mix and gives it more depth. And again, we can switch that in and out as we can with all of the processors we've seen so far. The stereo image processor can actually be a very dramatic effect. You can hear that just turning up the width control gives us a much wider mix, and it really seems to bring up the ambience in the mix as well. Now I'll turn up the space control. This is a mid-side processor, as I mentioned earlier, so what it's actually doing is changing the balance between the middle of the mix and the side of the mix. So this allows us to give the impression of things being much wider and to hear more of what's going on those outside edges. You can balance that so you get a nice widening of your mix while still maintaining the balances that you had before, and you do that by carefully balancing the space and the width controls. It's a really effective module. On a switch down here at the bottom, we have transformer on and off. Now this is an actual transformer inside the box, so how hard you hit that is going to determine how much it saturates and how much effect it has on your mix. Again, the input trim and the vintage drive are going to affect those because they do bring the level up and down. Now again, a transformer is not going to be a real intense effect. It's a fairly subtle effect, but what it does is make the bottom end seem bigger, and it adds a nice sheen on the top end as you drive that harder. Bringing the transformer in will give us tighter, bigger bottom end, while at the same time increasing the sheen on the top end. Now how much effect this has depends on how hard we're driving it. I've got the input trim pushed up a bit, but this is still a fairly subtle effect. That what's happening there is the top end is getting a nice sheen to it, a nice openness, and the bottom end seems to expand just a little bit, get a little bit bigger while still staying nice and tight. The Fusion does also offer an insert point, and that's available on the back panel on XLR connections. Now, this insert can function in one of two different ways. It can either be set up to operate on the stereo mix as you'd expect, so you can insert a stereo processor into the chain, and that can either be pre-EQ or post-EQ. We turn the insert point on by hitting the switch once. If we press and hold, we'll switch to the second mode, which is mid-side mode. In this case, the XLRs operate separately. So one set of XLRs processes the mid part of the signal, while the other set of XLRs processes the sides. So we can apply compression independently to the mid or the sides, EQ independently to the two parts. You can do a lot of creative processing work by using that insert in mid-side mode. Returning to stereo mode is as simple as pressing and holding the button again. Finally, we have an output trim control, which allows us to balance the processed signal level against the unprocessed signal level, and that allows for easy comparison using the bypass switch. We've listened to all the modules individually, but we can also combine them in any combination that we like to get the effect that we want. So maybe we want vintage drive on our mix, but we don't want the high frequency compression. We'll leave our transformer active. We'll do a little bit of widening, but not as much space, so we'll just widen that a little bit. Bring in our drive. We'll probably need to bring our trim down just a little bit. Stereo imaging. And then we have a nice composite processing effect that's being applied to our overall mix. So you can hear that the processing at this point, with that bit of drive adding more harmonic content, saturation from the transformer, and our stereo width imaging is really giving a nice lift to our mix. We'll get just a little bit more sheen out of things, and at the same time, we'll warm it up with some analog tape style processing. I'm going to bring that threshold down just a little bit. Again, you can hear that we're getting a nice lift when the Fusion is applied to our mix. Really opens things up, gives us a little more width, really makes the mix seem more alive. It sort of gets dull sounding when we don't have this processor active. This is a very effective box, although it does subtle processing things. You can really hear what's happening in your overall mix. It's a nice complement to a hybrid studio where you're working in the digital domain, but you want some nice analog warmth and processing on the back end of your mixes. Be sure to check it out. I think you're really going to like it. Thanks for joining me for Sweetwater Soundcheck. I'm Mitch Gallagher.